October 14th, 1943, 4 o'clock in the morning. East Anglia, England. The darkness sits heavy over the airfields of the 8th Air Force. A damp cold rolls in from the North Sea, the kind that slips through leather and wool and settles deep inside the bones. The fog is low and white over the tarmac, and in the gray murk of the pre-dawn hours, enormous shapes materialize along the hardstands like prehistoric creatures resting before the hunt. They sit wing to wing in the English mist, four-engined, silver-painted, impossibly large, each one the length of a city bus and twice as tall, with names painted across their noses in bold civilian script. Hell's Angels, Lady Be Good, Virgin's Delight, Ye Old Pub. Names born in the homesick imaginations of young men from Ohio and Tennessee and Oregon, who were a long way from everything they had ever known. Inside the briefing halls, the lights are already burning. 291 aircrew, navigators, bombardiers, pilots, waist gunners, ball turret gunners, tail gunners, take their seats shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, still smelling of sleep and the morning's powdered eggs, still clutching mugs of hot black coffee that sends thin white columns of steam drifting toward the ceiling. When the curtain is pulled back and the ribbons of red string are stretched across the map of occupied Europe, all the way to Schweinfurt, deep in the German heartland, 400 miles away, the room inhales in unison. And for one silent moment, as 291 men understand simultaneously what this day will ask of them. That morning, many of them would not return. But for those who did return, shattered, torn, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid and the blood of crewmates over the green fields of England, their homecoming would confound every military calculation the German Reich had made about the limits of an aircraft and the will of the men inside it. When the B-17 Flying Fortress began returning from the skies over Schweinfurt that afternoon, engines dead, fuselages punched through with hundreds of shrapnel holes, tails hanging by threads of aluminum skin, wings stripped to the bone, German intelligence officers struggled to write reports that made any rational sense. What they were looking at was not supposed to be possible. A nation that had mastered the science of anti-aircraft artillery, that had invested years and millions of Reichsmarks in building the most sophisticated flak defense system the world had ever seen, was watching its work rendered incomplete, and in some cases almost irrelevant, by an aircraft that simply refused to die. To understand why that stunned the Germans, we must first understand the world into which the B-17 was born. On July 28, 1935, a four-engined monoplane rolled out of a hangar at the Boeing factory in Seattle, Washington. A reporter from the Seattle Times named Richard Williams was standing on the tarmac when the plane taxied past, its 5 machine gun positions bristling from nose to tail. And Williams reached for his notepad and wrote a caption that would echo through history. He called it a 15-ton flying fortress. Boeing executives saw the headline, understood its power, and trademarked the name before the day was out. The Flying Fortress was born not in a board meeting or a military specification document, but in the instinctive recognition by a civilian journalist that what he was looking at was something fundamentally different from anything that had flown before. The plane had been designed by a team of Boeing engineers led by E. Gifford Emery and Edward Curtis Wells, working in an era before digital modeling, before computer stress analysis, before any of the precision tools that modern aerospace engineers take for granted. What they produced was a product of the old discipline: generous margins, redundant systems, over-engineered structures. When they calculated the load-bearing capacity of a wing spar, they added a buffer. When they designed a fuel system, they gave it backups. When they mounted the 4 Wright Cyclone R1-820 radial engines, each delivering 1,200 horsepower, they mounted them on a wing so broad, so deep between its twin spars, that a shell could punch entirely through the wing and emerge the other side having struck nothing critical at all. The empty space inside that wing was not an accident. It was, in a very real sense, a philosophy. American engineers in 1935 designed a machine that could absorb punishment because they believed from the beginning that it would have to. On January 17, 1936, the United States Army Air Corps ordered 13 of the bombers for service testing. Yet by the time the United States was drawn into the Second World War in December 1941, the B-17 had already undergone years of refinement, from the early B and C models to the hardened E variant with its dramatically expanded tail assembly and powered gun turrets, to the F and eventually the G, the final, definitive, uncompromising version, armed with 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns and capable of carrying a 6,000-pound bomb load at altitudes approaching 30,000 feet. 12,731 B-17 would ultimately be built at Boeing's sprawling Plant 2 in Seattle, at Lockheed Vega in Burbank, California, and at Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach. 3 factories, 1 nation, an industrial river that would not run dry. And the doctrine that sent these aircraft to war was as bold as the machine itself. American air power theorists at the Air Corps Tactical School had developed a concept called daylight precision strategic bombardment. The argument, in essence, was this: if you could destroy the critical nodes of an enemy's industrial system, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, oil refineries, rail marshalling yards, you could collapse a modern industrial war machine without having to defeat the enemy's army in the field. It was a radical idea. It was also an idea that required placing bombers over heavily defended targets in broad daylight, in tight formation, where every German anti-aircraft battery and interceptor squadron in the Reich could see them and engage them at maximum effectiveness. Yet the airmen who flew those missions understood the mathematics. In 1943, at the height of the unescorted bombing campaign, statistics compiled by the 8th Air Force showed that a bomber crew, statistically speaking, could not be expected to survive their required 25-mission combat tour. The odds were simply and frankly against survival. Yet the aircraft kept filling, the missions kept launching, and the formations kept assembling over East Anglia in the gray English dawn. Box after box after box of silver aircraft climbing into the overcast, climbing through the clouds, breaking into the cold, brutal clarity of the stratosphere above, where the temperature fell to 55 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and where frost gathered on every surface, and frostbite could claim fingers and ears and toes before a man ever saw a fighter or heard a flak burst. The 8th Air Force's Medical Corps documented more hospitalizations from frostbite than from battle wounds. Think about that. The sky itself was one of the war's most efficient weapons, and the men flew into it anyway, every day, sustained by nothing more extraordinary than duty and the trust they placed in the machine beneath them. On the German side of that equation, confidence was high, and for good reason. The German Flak, the anti-aircraft artillery arm of the Luftwaffe, had been built over years of meticulous engineering and operational doctrine into the most lethal ground-based air defense system in the world. At its peak, the Flak comprised more than 1 million personnel. At its guns stretched in concentric rings around every significant industrial target in the Reich, clustered most densely in the Ruhr Valley, what Allied crews grimly called the Happy Valley, a description soaked in irony, and along the primary bomber routes that led toward Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, Schweinfurt. These guns ranged from the fast-firing 20mm light flak used against low-altitude attackers to the enormous 128mm railway-mounted heavy guns that could reach 40,000 feet. But the heart of the system, its most iconic and most feared weapon, was the 88mm Flak 36. The German 88mm anti-aircraft gun was the most celebrated artillery piece of the Second World War, and the reputation was fully earned. It's mounted on a cruciform platform that allowed it to traverse a full 360 degrees and elevate to engage targets at any altitude. The 88mm combined the range of heavy artillery with a rate of fire that could put up to 15 rounds per minute into the sky. Its shells were fused to detonate at pre-calculated altitudes, throwing storms of razor-sharp steel shrapnel outward in lethal, expanding spheres. A single direct hit from an 88mm shell could, and frequently did, destroy a heavy bomber instantly. Near misses could punch dozens of holes in aluminum skin, sever control cables, ignite fuel, wound or kill crew members in the open positions of the aircraft's waist, tail, and ball turret. German gun crews were disciplined, trained to a high standard, but working in batteries of 4 guns whose shells were designed to walk a barrage across a bomber formation in timed sequence. First shell, 2 seconds. Second shell, 2 seconds. A metronome of destruction. The Luftwaffe had a name for what this system would do to Allied bombers. They called it a Sperrfeuer, a barrier fire, a wall of exploding steel through which no aircraft could pass unscathed. The theory was sound, the physics were correct, the guns were excellent, the crews were professional, and by any reasonable accounting of the laws of aeronautical engineering, an aircraft that absorbed the kind of punishment that a concentrated battery of 88mm guns could deliver should, in the vast majority of cases, be destroyed. What the Germans had not fully accounted for was the B-17 flying fortress. When the first significant encounters between American heavy bombers and German anti-aircraft defenses began in 1942, German gun crews observed something that confused them. The bombers came in high, impossibly high, at 25, 27, sometimes 30,000 feet, in tight, mutually supporting formations designed to saturate any attacker with a wall of defensive machine gun fire. The guns below tracked them, calculated the intercept, fired their barrages, and the bombers flew through. Some fell, some smoked and peeled away, but others flew through curtains of exploding steel that should have torn them apart, and continued flying, continued navigating, continued pressing toward the target, then dropped their bombs, then turned for England, then flew home. German flak crews documented their ammunition expenditures with Teutonic precision. The reports that came back to Luftwaffe headquarters in 1942 and 1943 contained figures that were, by any prior standard of air warfare, staggering. By 1944, German calculations showed that it required an average of 16,000 rounds of 88mm flak, 36 ammunition to shoot down a single American heavy bomber. 16,000 rounds. The more advanced 88mm Flak 41, one of the best anti-aircraft guns ever produced, required 8,500 rounds. Even the massive 105mm gun required 6,000. These were not the numbers of an efficient weapons system cleanly dispatching its adversary, as these were the numbers of a system engaged in something closer to a siege, pouring metal into the sky in enormous quantities against an adversary that absorbed it all and kept flying. Historians and military analysts have pointed out, accurately, that German flak was ultimately responsible for more Allied aircraft losses than fighter interception. An estimated 5,380 American aircraft destroyed by flak against 4,274 lost to enemy fighters. The flak belt was real, and its cost in blood and aircraft was enormous. But what those numbers do not capture, what the raw accounting of losses obscures, is the number of aircraft that were hit by flak and returned anyway. The bombers that came home with 1 engine gone, 2 engines gone. Yes, the aircraft that returned with holes in the fuselage so large that a man could climb through them. The machines that crossed the English coast trailing smoke from wounds that by any conventional standard should have been fatal, and then put their wheels on the grass of English airfields and came to rest and let their crews climb out, shaking and frostbitten and alive. Those aircraft were the ones that stunned the Germans, not the ones that went down, the ones that came home. The first serious German reckoning with the B-17 came in October 1942, when a downed flying fortress was salvaged from a crash site and transported to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier experimental aircraft testing and evaluation facility. There, in the hangars of Germany's most sophisticated aerospace laboratory, senior Luftwaffe leadership gathered to examine the aircraft up close for the first time. Colonel Adolf Galland was there. Galland was already one of the most celebrated fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, and he would later become General of Fighter Aircraft, the officer responsible for the entire German day fighter arm. When he walked around the reassembled wreckage of the fallen fortress, what he found troubled him deeply. He did not hide his concern. "It unites every possible advantage in one bomber," Galland wrote in his assessment. "Firstly, heavy armor. Secondly, enormous altitude. Thirdly, colossal defensive armament. And fourthly, great speed." These were not the words of a man who had seen something he expected to defeat easily. These were the words of a professional warrior who recognized with clear eyes and that his adversary had built something formidable. Galland's assessment proved deeply divisive within the Luftwaffe's senior leadership. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, the Luftwaffe's state secretary and the man responsible for German aircraft production and planning, looked at the same aircraft and drew conclusions that kept him awake at night. "The Reichsmarschall told me that there is no cause for anxiety about the American aircraft and that, four-engined though they may be, we can contemplate future equanimity," Milch said. And then he added, "I told him that I do not agree." That disagreement was not a small thing. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, it was a man of enormous vanity and dangerous optimism, a man who had already told Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army at Stalingrad by air, a claim that would end in catastrophe. His dismissal of the B-17 threat was characteristic. Milch knew better. In the weeks following the Rechlin examination, Milch grew increasingly alarmed. German reconnaissance flights over eastern England had returned with photographs showing extensive new airfield construction, runways being extended, hardstands being multiplied, fuel depots being built. All of it pointed unmistakably toward one conclusion. What was coming was not a trickle of bombers. What was coming was a flood. Milch looked at the photographs and at the production figures he was beginning to receive about American manufacturing output, and he named 1943 with extraordinary accuracy. He called it the year of clenched teeth. The Luftwaffe's chief of general staff, Hans Jaschonek, was less prescient. "We will fetch these four-engined bombers down just as quickly as the twin-engined ones," he insisted. "And the loss of a four-engined bomber means a much higher loss to the enemy." History would not vindicate him. By March 1943, Milch had compressed his entire assessment into a single, devastating sentence. Standing before his colleagues in the councils of the Luftwaffe's leadership, he said, "Things don't look rosy for our big cities." He was right, but he had not yet seen what those bombers could withstand. The evidence of the B-17's extraordinary survivability accumulated mission by mission, aircraft by aircraft throughout 1943 and into 1944, building in the documentary record of the 8th Air Force a portrait of an aircraft that defied the expectations of everyone who tried to destroy it. On February 1, 1943, a B-17F designated serial number 41-2, 4406, and named All-American, was flying with the 97th Bombardment Group out of Algeria when it was attacked by a German Messerschmitt Me-109 fighter during the return from a bombing run over Tunisia. The fighter pressed its attack head-on. The gunners on the All-American were firing back continuously. Something, a bullet perhaps, or multiple impacts, struck the German pilot or his aircraft at the critical moment, and instead of completing its intended diving pass beneath the B-17, the 109 failed to roll clear. Its wing struck the B-17's fuselage at the midpoint with the force of a blade. The German fighter's wing cut nearly all the way through the fortress's rear fuselage. The tail section was left hanging by a narrow strip of metal skin and a few slender structural spars, nothing more. The All-American began to climb involuntarily, her trim tabs destroyed, her control surfaces barely responsive, the severed tail swaying with every gust of wind. Her pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, applied simultaneous pressure to the controls with both hands and both knees to hold her level. His navigator told him that they had roughly 200 miles of hostile territory and open sea between them and their base. Every airman on board understood that the tail could depart the aircraft at any moment. No one bailed out. Bragg brought the All-American home on what remained of her structure, landed her on the desert airfield, and the aircraft ground to a stop. Photographs taken immediately afterward show a sight that seems to belong to a nightmare rather than to aeronautical reality. A B-17 with its entire rear section cut nearly clean through, hanging at a visible angle from the main body of the aircraft, held together by metal that a man could span with his arms. And yet it had flown, and yet the crew had lived. When those photographs were eventually circulated through the intelligence services of both sides, German analysts stared at them with something that can only be described as bewilderment. That same year, an aged veteran who had survived his war would eventually write a letter to the Boeing company. And he described a mission over Germany from which he returned to England with 179 flak holes in his aircraft and only 2 of his 4 engines producing any power at all. 179 documented points of entry where German anti-aircraft fire had penetrated his aircraft's skin, and the aircraft had carried him home. At the end of the letter, the old man wrote with a simplicity that transcends all oratory. "I'm glad to be alive. Thank you for making such a good airplane." These were not isolated incidents. Photographs held in archives on both sides of the Atlantic document B-17 EKs returning from missions with tail sections almost completely destroyed by direct flak hits, with entire engine nacelles shredded to bare metal frames, with sections of wing skin peeled away over lengths of 10 and 15 feet. Yes, with cockpit canopies shattered, with radio rooms torn open to the sky, with ball turrets jammed and waste windows blown in, and the bare aluminum longerons of the fuselage exposed to the freezing air above Germany. The images are almost impossible to accept as photographs of aircraft that flew home. They look like aircraft that should have come down over the target. They look like things that should have burned and broken and fallen into the German farmland below. And yet, mission after mission, the record shows aircraft in this condition crossing the English coast, making their radio calls, entering the landing patterns over their home fields, and setting down, sometimes on flattened tires, sometimes on belly, sometimes on one gear, sometimes with engines streaming fire that burned out before the runway. Yet they came home because the aircraft had been built to let them come home. The reason for this survivability is inseparable from the philosophy of American engineering and American industrial culture that produced the B-17 in the first place. The bomber's wing was a key element of its durability. Unlike the sleek, high-efficiency Davis wing of the rival B-24 Liberator, a wing that generated enormous lift but left little structural tolerance for damage, the B-17's broad, high-mounted wing was cavernous in its interior. The wide separation between its main structural spars meant that a flak burst penetrating the wing would frequently pass through nothing but empty air, and the same round that would destroy a Liberator's wing by severing a critical load-bearing element would punch harmlessly through a B-17's wing if it happened to enter an ixt between the spars. German fighter pilots who attacked both types quickly developed a tactical preference. When given a choice, they went for the B-24. The fortress was, as Luftwaffe ace Willy Reschke, a man who had destroyed 24 engined bombers during the war, frankly acknowledged in his post-war assessments, a hard nut. The B-24, he said, was far easier to bring down. The fuselage contributed its own form of resilience. The semi-monocoque construction, a skin of aluminum sheeting riveted over a frame of curved formers and longitudinal stringers, could absorb hundreds of small perforations without losing structural integrity. The airframe was, and in the language of engineering, statically indeterminate, designed with more load paths than the minimum required, so that when one member was cut or damaged, the loads it had carried could redistribute across the remaining structure. It was this characteristic, this redundancy engineered into the metal itself, that allowed a B-17 to fly with its tail nearly shorn away, to fly with one engine feathered and another running rough, to fly with hydraulic fluid running out of punctured lines and fuel streaming from hold tanks and the cabin temperature below zero through a shattered window. The machine could sustain injury that would be fatal to a lesser structure and still function, still carry its crew, still find the English coast and the grass of the airfield and the end of the mission. Yet the four Wright Cyclone R-1820 engines contributed powerfully to this survival profile. Each engine was independent. Each had its own fuel line, its own ignition system, its own oil supply. A B-17 could fly on 3 engines without losing formation, could maintain controlled flight on 2, could reach a friendly airfield on 1, a feat that most other bombers of the era simply could not match. In the post-mission debrief reports filed in England after the worst missions of 1943, crew after crew described returning on 3 engines, on 2, on 1 engine running rough with oil pressure dropping, and arriving. Always arriving. The engines, those enormous cylindrical machines of American manufacturing, ran when they should have stopped. Yet they ran when the oil was gone, and the cowlings were bent, and the exhaust manifolds were cracked, and shrapnel had carved channels through the supercharger housings. They ran, sometimes, until the wheels touched the runway, and then they quit. As if they had known, with a machined precision that approached something like purpose, exactly how long they needed to keep turning. The men who witnessed this from the German side, the Flak battery commanders, the Luftwaffe intelligence officers, the senior staff officers who read the after-action reports and studied the reconnaissance photographs, experienced something in the winter and spring of 1943 that is difficult to categorize neatly as fear or frustration or professional crisis. It was, perhaps, so closest to the unsettling feeling that arrives when a fundamental assumption about the way the world works proves to be wrong. German military doctrine, shaped by European continental tradition, had always conceived of war as a finite resource competition. You destroyed the enemy's capacity to wage war by destroying his equipment faster than he could replace it. The Flakwaffe's mission was straightforward: shoot down enough bombers to make the operational cost of strategic bombing prohibitive. Force the 8th Air Force to stop sending aircraft over Germany. The mathematics were clean. A destroyed bomber, costing the Americans an aircraft, a trained 10-man crew, and the months of preparation that produced them, was a removed capability. Accumulate enough of those removals and the enemy's strategic air campaign would collapse. Yet this was the theory. It was, by any conventional analysis, a reasonable theory. What it did not account for was the speed of American industrial production. By the summer of 1943, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega were producing B-17 at a rate that had no precedent in the history of military aviation. The assembly lines ran around the clock, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Women who had never held an industrial tool 18 months before were now riveting the aluminum skin of a bomber with the efficiency of veteran technicians. Every German anti-aircraft shell that pierced an American bomber over Schweinfurt or the Ruhr Valley had, as its counterpart, an American factory floor where a replacement was already being assembled. For every B-17 that went down over Germany, more than one was rolling off the production line. As the attrition war that the Flak was prosecuting with such professional dedication was being won by the side with the larger industrial base, and the side with the larger industrial base was the side whose young men and women had grown up with the idea that a problem could be solved by working harder, building more, staying longer at the workbench. The side whose economy had not been on a war footing for decades of militarist preparation, but had been, until 3 years before, producing automobiles and appliances and radios and every other comfort of a prosperous civilian society, and which now turned that enormous productive apparatus toward war with a speed and completeness that the German economy, for all its famous organization, could not match. Field Marshal Milch understood this. He had understood it since October 1942, yet when he stood in the Rechlin hangar and looked at the wreckage of a B-17, and saw in its construction not merely an aircraft, but an argument that said, the nation that built this has more of everything. More metal, more fuel, more precision machining, more engineering talent, more workers, more factories, and they are going to keep sending it until there is nothing left to defend against. On October 14, 1943, the day that would enter the history of the air war as Black Thursday, the full weight of what Milch had seen in that Rechlin hangar was delivered, in aluminum and blood and fire, over the skies of central Germany. In 291 B-17 Guerriers of the 8th Air Force's 1st and 3rd Air Divisions launched from East Anglia that morning and flew toward the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, 400 miles into the German heartland, beyond the range of their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts, into airspace where the Luftwaffe could marshal every available fighter and every available flak gun. The American P-47s flew alongside the formation as far as their fuel would allow, roughly 200 miles, and then they wagged their wings in a gesture of farewell and peeled away, and the B-17 continued east alone. What followed was among the most savage single days of aerial combat in the entire history of warfare. By the Luftwaffe came at the formations in waves, single-engine Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s attacking head-on in pairs and fours, firing their 20mm cannons at point-blank range, rolling through the formation and diving away and climbing back for another pass. Behind them came the twin-engined Junkers Ju-88s, staying deliberately outside the effective range of the B-17's guns, launching 21-centimeter rockets from beneath their wings. Rockets each carrying more explosive charge than 4 cannon shells combined, capable of destroying a bomber in a single salvo. The sky between the target and the Dutch coast was marked by smoke columns rising from stricken aircraft and by the parachutes of those fortunate enough to escape the falling machines. It as the flak over Schweinfurt itself was the heaviest the American crews had yet encountered. When the Luftwaffe fighters withdrew to let the bombers run their target, the German anti-aircraft guns took over, and at 25,000 feet, the sky around the formation became a continuous, flickering constellation of black smoke bursts, each one a shell detonated at the calculated altitude, throwing its storm of steel fragments outward in a sphere 40 feet across. For the men at the waist guns and in the ball turrets and the tail positions, exposed in the open, unheated gun positions of the B-17, the sound of shrapnel hitting aluminum was a constant metal rain. Captain Lester Rentmester, piloting a B-17 called Jeannie Marie over Germany during one of the missions of this terrible period, she recorded the experience in his diary. A tremendous crash, the aircraft thrown violently upward, the controls going dead in his hands, the right wing dropping straight down until it pointed at the earth, and in the cockpit, 2 pilots exerting every ounce of their strength and weight on controls that refused to respond. And then, finally, a slow rightening, the aircraft recovering from what should have been its last dive, and Rentmeester, sitting in his seat, bathed in sweat and air that was 30 below zero, aware that he was alive in a way that had no equivalent in ordinary experience. When the surviving B-17s of the second Schweinfurt raid landed in England that evening, the numbers that ground crews compiled on the hardstands were almost beyond comprehension. 60 B-17s had been shot down, 600 men gone into Germany, into prison camps or cemeteries, or simply into the earth. Another 17 aircraft were so extensively damaged that they would never fly again. 121 more had sustained damage requiring repair before their next mission. In a single day, nearly 20% of the men who had climbed into those aircraft before dawn were dead, wounded, or missing. The 8th Air Force commander, Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, publicly claimed victory and proclaimed that the Luftwaffe was feeling the teeth of the American air offensive in its neck. Privately, his headquarters was in crisis. The unescorted deep penetration mission into Germany had proven, on this day, to be unsustainable. The deep raids stopped. For months, yet the 8th Air Force restricted itself to targets that could be covered by fighter escort, a direct and humbling acknowledgement that the system, as then constituted, could not bear the cost. And yet, and this is the element of Black Thursday that tends to disappear in the accounting of the dead, 194 of those B-17Ps came home. 194 aircraft, struck by shells and shrapnel and cannon fire for hours over 400 miles of hostile sky, came home. Some of those aircraft had absorbed dozens of flak holes. Some had lost engines. Some had lost parts of their tails, pieces of their wings, sections of their fuselage skin. Some had brought home their wounded and their dead alongside their living. And they came home because the machine that held them was built to the margins that American engineers had over-engineered into every structure, every system, every component, built to a standard of survivability that, in the skies over Schweinfurt in the autumn of 1943, proved to be the difference between a catastrophe and a campaign that continued. In the weeks and months that followed Black Thursday, German intelligence analysts began to accumulate a growing collection of documented cases that they could not explain away. The photographs were the most disturbing evidence. Image after image of B-17 Felwes photographed by German reconnaissance cameras or described by German ground observers, aircraft trailing smoke from 2 engines and still maintaining formation speed. Aircraft with tail surfaces shot away that were photographed still flying level. Aircraft with entire sections of fuselage skin removed by near-miss detonations that were recorded landing in England after missions that had taken them over Hamburg or Bremen or the Ruhr. The German assessment teams at Rechlin, tasked with evaluating the combat effectiveness of their anti-aircraft weapons, began to realize something deeply uncomfortable. The B-17 was not merely a durable aircraft. It was a structurally different kind of problem than the one their weapons had been calibrated to solve. The conventional measure of an anti-aircraft weapon's effectiveness was a binary one. Did it bring the aircraft down? If the answer was yes, the shell was effective. If the answer was no, the shell was wasted. But the B-17 was forcing a third category into existence. There were shells that hit the aircraft, penetrated its structure, damaged its systems, wounded its crew, and yet left it flying. An aircraft in this condition, damaged but not destroyed, was enormously costly to the mission it was flying and enormously costly to the men aboard it. But it was not a kill. And in the German accounting of attrition warfare, a damaged aircraft that returned to its base was repaired in 48 hours and flew again was not a victory. It was a failure of the weapon system to complete its function. German gun crews grew increasingly frustrated by what they observed. The 88mm gun that had been so devastatingly effective against British twin-engined bombers and against every other aircraft it had engaged in the Spanish Civil War, in North Africa, out in the early days of the Allied bombing campaign, This same gun was being expended at rates that consumed German ammunition stockpiles faster than any pre-war calculation had suggested possible. The German Quartermaster General of the Air Force produced tables showing the consumption of flak ammunition per bomber destroyed, and those tables were sobering. They showed not a system that was efficiently defending the Reich, but a system that was in a grinding, resource-intensive contest of attrition with an adversary whose industrial production of bombers and ammunition both exceeded its own capacity for destruction. The math was working against Germany, and everyone in Luftwaffe headquarters who was paying clear-eyed attention to the numbers knew it. Through all of this, there was an object that accumulated in the floor spaces of every B-17 that flew a combat mission over Germany. It was a small thing, individually considered, a spent .50 caliber machine gun shell casing, brass-colored, cylindrical, about 3.5 inches long and less than an inch in diameter. After an engagement with German fighters, after a run through a belt of flak, after the gunners in every position had been firing continuously for minutes that felt like hours, these casings piled up around the gun positions in heaps that reached the ankles. Waist gunners waded in them. Ball turret gunners could hear them ringing against the metal floor beneath the aircraft as the casings ejected and fell. The bombardier in his nose position, the tail gunner on his knees in the aft position. All of them existed amid a deepening accumulation of spent brass that clanked and rolled and shifted with every maneuver of the aircraft. In one sense, these casings were simply the residue of combat, the physical remnant of the defensive fire that was the B-17's only means of answering the attacks of German fighters. But in a larger sense, each one of those small brass cylinders was the product of an American factory somewhere in the industrial heartland of a democracy that was not, and had never been, a militarist state. Each shell had been manufactured on an assembly line in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Michigan, packaged by workers who had, the previous year, been making refrigerators or bicycles or automobile components. Each shell was loaded onto a truck, onto a train, onto a ship. It transported across the Atlantic, trucked across England, loaded into belts, and handed to a 20-year-old from Nebraska or Georgia or California, who was now riding at 27,000 feet over the heart of the Reich, firing it in defense of his own life and the lives of his crewmates. The Germans would fire 16,000 artillery shells to destroy one B-17. The American gunners, in the course of a single mission, would expend thousands of .50 caliber rounds from the aircraft's 13 gun positions. Both sides were consuming metal at a rate that would have been unimaginable a decade before. But only one side had the industrial capacity to keep that rate of consumption sustainable. By 1944, when the long-range P-51 Mustang finally gave the 8th Air Force the fighter escort that the bombers had needed since the beginning, and the B-17 formations were no longer fighting alone over the Reich. But the foundation of what the P-51s protected, the platform whose durability justified the entire enterprise, the machine that could absorb the punishment of a German sky and bring its crew home, was the same aircraft that had been flying into that sky since 1942. And when the American escort fighters arrived in force, and the Luftwaffe began to be ground down over its own territory, and the gun batteries that had fired their 16,000 rounds began to run short of ammunition, and the German cities began to receive those 640,000 tons of bombs that the B-17 BTS would ultimately deposit on the industrial architecture of the Third Reich. It was the accumulated history of survival, just of every fortress that had come home when it should not have come home, that made that final reckoning possible. There was a moment, some weeks after Black Thursday, when a German intelligence officer tasked with compiling the assessment of the October 14th raid paused over the photographs of B-17 AEDS that had returned to England in various states of devastation. He was a professional, a trained analyst, and he was looking at these images with the detached clarity of a man trying to solve a problem. What he saw in those photographs was not what any of his training or any of his nation's doctrine had prepared him to see. He saw aircraft that had been struck by the most powerful anti-aircraft guns in the world and had not fallen. He saw machines that had absorbed direct hits, near-miss detonations, cannon shells, rocket blasts, and the accumulated violence of some of the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire in the history of aerial warfare, and had continued to function, to navigate, to carry their crews, to cross 500 miles of hostile sky and set their wheels on English grass. He saw proof that something had gone wrong in the calculation, that the weapon and the target existed in some relationship that his equations had failed to anticipate. He was right. Something had gone wrong. What had gone wrong was that the Germans had assumed they were dealing with a machine built to ordinary standards, built to the standards of sufficiency, to the margins of what was needed and no more. What they were actually dealing with was a machine built by a nation that had something to prove, a nation whose engineers added the extra spar cap, the redundant fuel line, yet the overspecified structural member, not because the specifications demanded it, but because the culture that trained those engineers had made a habit of building things that lasted beyond the calculated requirement, that worked when they were supposed to have failed, that endured. That habit was called many things in America. It was called craftsmanship. It was called Yankee ingenuity. It was called the American way of making things. But underneath all those labels was something more fundamental. It was the expression, in riveted aluminum and tempered steel, of a free people's confidence that the problems placed before them could be solved if enough intelligence and care and labor were brought to bear. The B-17 was not a political document, but it carried, in its design, as the practical consequences of political freedom, of a society that allowed its engineers to study and argue and compete and improve, that gave its workers the material security to take pride in their labor, that could mobilize the full productive capacity of a free market economy in service of a common purpose and sustain that mobilization for years without the economy cracking under the pressure. Against that, the German Luftwaffe had arrayed 16,000 rounds per kill. Against that, the Messerschmitts had come in waves from the east. Against that, a nation had poured its treasure and its engineering genius and the lives of its soldiers and its gunners and its fighter pilots into the sky over Germany, trying to stop something that would not stop. And the flying fortresses had kept flying. It is 75 years after the last B-17 rolled off the production line, an old man sat down at a table and wrote a letter to Boeing. He was 88 years old. He had done his flying over Germany in 1943 and 1944, when he was young and the sky over the Ruhr was filled with black smoke that smelled of cordite and burning aluminum. He wrote about a mission from which he had returned with 179 holes punched through his aircraft by German Flak, and with 2 of his 4 engines gone, and with England somewhere ahead of him through the mist and the failing light of a European afternoon. He wrote about sitting in the cockpit of a machine that had no business remaining in the air, watching the instruments he could still read and working the controls that still responded, and listening to the 2 engines that still ran, and flying west, always west, toward England, toward the airfield, toward another dawn. When he had said all of this, he said only one more thing. He said he was glad to be alive. He said, "Thank you for making such a good airplane." In those 14 words lives the entire story of what the B-17 meant and what it did and why. Decades after the last mission, the memory of these aircraft still carries such weight in the history of the war. Not because they were perfect, not because they always came home. They did not always come home. Thousands of them did not. And the men inside them are buried in European soil and in the cold waters of the North Sea, and in the endless lists that the 8th Air Force compiled of its killed, its missing, its wounded, its gone. But because they came home when they should not have. And because the math of destruction that the German Reich had constructed, 16,000 shells, 1,000,000 gunners, batteries of 80s ringed around every city worth defending, was answered year after year, mission after mission, by an aircraft whose designers had understood, in some practical and unphilosophical way, that the purpose of the machine was to bring the men inside it home. This is what the Germans were stunned by. Not the speed of the B-17, not its altitude, not the defensive fire of its 13 Browning machine guns, though all of those things impressed and troubled them. What stunned them, what Galland wrote about with a professional's clear-eyed respect, what Milch had seen coming from the first moment he walked around that reassembled wreck at Rechlin. What a million German artillerymen laboring at their guns through the terrible winter and spring of 1943 experienced as a kind of mechanical bewilderment was the survival. The simple, stubborn, infuriating, magnificent fact of survival. The fact that you could put 1,000 holes in a B-17 and it would keep flying. The fact that you could tear its tail nearly off and it would fly home on what remained. The fact that you could kill 2 of its engines and wound half its crew and punch holes in its skin from nose to tail, and it would find the English coast and descend through the fog and put its wheels on the grass. And in the years that followed, in the long decades of peace that the sacrifices of that war purchased, the lesson of the Flying Fortress endured in a form more durable than aluminum or steel. As it endured in the understanding that a free society, given sufficient cause and sufficient will, could build things that outlasted the violence intended to destroy them. That it could pour its abundance, its rivers of brass shell casings, its endless production of aircraft and engines and precision instruments, its inexhaustible supply of young men willing to climb into the sky above an enemy continent in the cold dark of a pre-dawn morning, into the making and maintaining of a world in which such young men need not, in the end, make that sacrifice again. The Flying Fortresses flew because they were well made. They were well made because they were built by free men, for free men, in a country that had not yet been asked to prove what it was worth, and which, when finally asked, answered the question 400 miles above Germany, yet in the black smoke and the freezing air and the spent brass ringing on the floor, in a sky that should have killed them, and did not. They came home, and that, in the end, is the only history that matters.